Hello, friends. Where we left off on the Rainy River was when Tim had already explained um, his ideas about he had expressed some level of uneasiness with the story he was going to tell, expressed what he thought was the nature of courage, and then explained his thoughts on the war and getting his draft notice, and said something in him snapped from the conflict there, and he took off. So we'll pick up there. I drove north. It's a blur now as it was then, and all I remember is a sense of high velocity and the feel of the steering wheel in my hands. I was riding on adrenaline, a giddy feeling in a way, except there was the dreamy edge of impossibility to it, like running a dead end maze, no way out. It couldn't come to a happy conclusion, and yet I was doing it anyway, because it was all I could think of to do. It was pure flight, fast and mindless. I had no plan. Just hit the border at high speed and crash through and keep on running. Near dusk, I passed through Bemidji, then turned northeast toward International Falls. I spent the night in the car behind a closed down gas station a half mile from the border. In the morning, after gassing up, I headed straight west along the Rainy River, which separates Minnesota from Canada, and which, for me, separated one life from another. The land was mostly wilderness. Here and there I passed a motel or a bait shop, but otherwise the country unfolded in great sweeps of pine and birch and sumac. Though it was still August, the air already had the smell of October. Football season, piles of yellow-red leaves, everything crisp and clean. I remember a huge blue sky. Off to my right was the Rainy River, wide as a lake in places. And beyond the Rainy River was Canada. For a while I just drove, not aiming at anything. Then in the late morning I began to look for a place to lie low for a day or two. I was exhausted and scared sick, and around noon I pulled into an old fishing resort called the Tip Top Lodge. Actually, it was not a lodge at all, just 8 or 9 tiny yellow cabins clustered on a peninsula that jutted northward into the Rainy River. The place was in sorry shape. There was a dangerous wooden dock, an old minnow tank, a flimsy tar paper boathouse along the shore. The main building, which stood in a cluster of pines on high ground, seemed to lean heavily to one side like a cripple, the roof sagging toward Canada. Briefly, I thought about turning around, just giving up, but then I got out of the car and walked up to the front porch. The man who opened the door that day is the hero of my life. How do I say this without sounding sappy? Blurt it out. The man saved me. He offered exactly what I needed, without questions, without any words at all. He took me in. He was there at the critical time, a silent, watchful presence. 6 days later, when it ended, I was unable to find a proper way to thank him, and I never have. And so, if nothing else, this story represents a small gesture of gratitude 20 years overdue. Even after 2 decades, I can close my eyes and return to that porch at the Tip Top Lodge. I can see the old guy staring at me. Elroy Birdall, 81 years old, skinny and shrunken and mostly bald. He wore a flannel shirt and brown work pants. In one hand, I remember he carried a green apple, a small paring knife in the other. His eyes had the bluish color of a razor blade, the same polished shine, and as he peered up at me, I felt a strange sharpness, almost painful, a cutting sensation, as if his gaze were somehow slicing me open. I just want to pause there, having read that. Like, here's me, Mrs. Drexler, again. Like, how cool the way he writes, right? Like, he has a paring knife in his hand, and his eyes are the color of a razor blade, and they shine, and his look has a sharpness. It's almost painful, a cutting sensation, slicing me open, all the knife imagery. So good. Anyway, back to Elroy. In part, no doubt, it was my own sense of guilt, but even so, I am absolutely certain that the old man took one look and went right to the heart of things. A kid in trouble. When I asked for a room, Elroy made a little clicking sound with his tongue. He nodded, led me out to one of the cabins, and dropped a key in my hand. I remember smiling at him. I also remember wishing I hadn't. The old man shook his head, as if to tell me it wasn't worth the bother. Dinner at 5:30, he said. You eat fish? Anything, I said. Elroy grunted and said, I'll bet. We spent 6 days together at the Tip Top Lodge, just the two of us. Tourist season was over, and there were no boats on the river, and the wilderness seemed to withdraw into a great permanent stillness. Over those 6 days, Elroy Birdall and I took most of our meals together. In the mornings, we sometimes went on long hikes into the woods, and at night we played Scrabble or listened to records or sat reading in front of his big stone fireplace. At times I felt the awkwardness of an intruder, but Elroy accepted me into his quiet routine without fuss or ceremony. He took my presence for granted, the same way he might have sheltered a stray cat. No wasted sighs or pity. There was never any talk about it, just the opposite. What I remember more than anything is the man's willful, almost ferocious silence. In all that time together, in all those hours, he never asked the obvious question. Why was I there? Why alone? Why so preoccupied? If Elroy was curious about any of this, he was careful never to put it into words. My hunch, though, is that he already knew, at least the basics. After all, it was 1968, and guys were burning draft cards, and Canada was just a boat ride away. Elroy Birdall was no hick. His bedroom, I remember, was cluttered with books and newspapers. He killed me at the Scrabble board, barely concentrating, and on those occasions when speech was necessary, he had a way of compressing large thoughts into small cryptic packets of language. One evening, just at sunset, he pointed up at an owl circling over the violet-lighted forest to the west. Hey, O'Brien, he said. There's Jesus. The man was sharp. He didn't miss much. Those razor eyes. Now and then he'd catch me staring out at the river, the far shore, and I could almost hear the tumblers clicking in his head. Maybe I'm wrong, but I doubt it. One thing for certain, he knew I was in desperate trouble, and he knew I couldn't talk about it. The wrong word, or even the right word, and I would have disappeared. I was wired and jittery. My skin felt too tight. After supper one evening, I vomited and went back to my cabin and lay down for a few minutes and then vomited again. Another time, in the middle of the afternoon, I began sweating and couldn't shut it off. I went through whole days feeling dizzy with sorrow. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't lie still. At night, I'd toss around in bed, half awake, half dreaming, imagining how I'd sneak down to the beach and quietly push one of the old man's boats out into the river and start paddling my way toward Canada. There were times when I thought I'd gone off the psychic edge. I couldn't tell up from down. It was just falling. And late in the night, I'd lie there watching weird pictures spin through my head, getting chased by the Border Patrol, helicopters and searchlights and barking dogs. I'd be crashing through the woods. I'd be down on my hands and knees, people shouting out my name, the law closing in on all sides, my hometown draft board and the FBI and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It all seemed crazy and impossible. 21 years old, an ordinary kid with all the ordinary dreams and ambition. And all I wanted was to live the life I was born to, a mainstream life. I loved baseball and hamburgers and cherry cokes. And now I was off on the margins of exile, leaving my country forever, and it seemed so impossible and terrible and sad. Not sure how I made it through those 6 days. Most of it I can't remember. On 2 or 3 afternoons, to pass some time, I helped Elroy get the place ready for winter, sweeping down the cabins and hauling in the boats, little chores that kept my body moving. The days were cool and bright. The nights were very dark. One morning, the old man showed me how to split and stack firewood, and for several hours, we just worked in silence out behind his house. At one point, Elroy was small and looked at me for a long time, his lips drawn as if framing a difficult question, but then he shook his head and went back to work. The man's self-control was amazing. He never pried. He never put me in a position that required lies or denials. To an extent, I suppose, his reticence was typical of that part of Minnesota, where privacy still held value. And even if I'd been walking around with some horrible deformity, 4 arms and 3 heads, I'm sure the old man would have talked about everything except those extra arms and heads. Simple politeness was part of it. But even more than that, I think, the man understood that words were insufficient. The problem had gone beyond discussion. During that long summer, I'd been over and over the various arguments, all the pros and cons, and it was no longer a question that could be decided by an act of pure reason. Intellect had come up against emotion. My conscience told me to run, but some irrational and powerful force was resisting, like a weight pushing me toward the war. What it came down to, stupidly, was a sense of shame. Hot, stupid shame. I did not want people to think badly of me. Not my parents, not my brother and sister, not even the folks down at the Gobbler Cafe. I was ashamed to be there at the Tip Top Lodge. I was ashamed of my conscience, ashamed to be doing the right thing. Some of this Elroy must have understood. Not the details, of course, but the plain fact of crisis. Although the old man never confronted me about it, there was one occasion when he came close to forcing the whole thing out into the open. It was early evening, and we'd just finished supper, and over coffee and dessert I asked him about my bill, how much I owed so far. For a long while the old man squinted down at the tablecloth. Well, the basic rate, he said, is $50 a night, not counting meals. This makes 4 nights, right? I nodded. I had $312 in my wallet. Elroy kept his eyes on the tablecloth. Now, that's an on-season price. To be fair, I suppose we should knock it down a peg or two. He leaned back in his chair. What's a reasonable number, you figure? I don't know, I said. 40? 40's good. 40 a night. And then we tack on food. Say another 100? 260 total? I guess. He raised his eyebrows. Too much? No, that's fair. It's fine. Tomorrow, though, I think I'd better take off tomorrow. Elroy shrugged and began clearing the table. For a time he fussed with the dishes, whistling to himself as if the subject had been settled. After a second, he slapped his hands together. You know what we forgot, he said. We forgot wages. Those odd jobs you done. What we have to do, we have to figure out what your time's worth. Now, your last job, how much did you pull in an hour? Not enough, I said. A bad one? Yes, pretty bad. Slowly, then, without intending any long sermon, I told him about my days at the pig plant. It began as a straight recitation of the facts, but before I could stop myself, I was talking about the blood clots in the water gun and how the smell had soaked into my skin and how I couldn't wash it away. I went on for a long time. I told him about wild hogs squealing in my dreams, the sounds of butchery, slaughterhouse sounds, and how I'd sometimes wake up with that greasy pig stink in my throat. When I was finished, Elroy nodded at me. Well, to be honest, he said, when you first showed up here, I wondered about all that. The aroma, I mean. Smelled like you was awful damned fond of pork chops. The man almost smiled. He made a snuffling sound, then sat down with a pencil and a piece of paper. So, what did this crud job pay? $10 an hour? 15? Less. Elroy shook his head. Let's make it 15. You put in 25 hours here, easy. That's $375 total wages. We subtract the $260 for food and lodging. I still owe you $115. He took 4 50s out of his shirt pocket and laid them on the table. Call it even, he said. No. Pick it up. Get yourself a haircut. The money lay on the table for the rest of the evening. It was still there when I went back to my cabin. In the morning, though, I found an envelope tacked to my door. Inside were the 4 50s and a 2-word note that said, Emergency Fund. The man knew. Looking back after 20 years, I sometimes wonder if the events of that summer didn't happen in some other dimension, a place where your life exists before you've lived it and where it goes afterward. None of it ever seemed real. During my time at the Tip Top Lodge, I had the feeling that I'd slipped out of my own skin, hovering a few feet away while some poor yo-yo with my name and face tried to make his way toward a future he didn't understand, didn't want. Even now, I can see myself as I was then. It's like watching an old home movie. I'm young and tan and fit. I've got hair, lots of it. I don't smoke or drink. I'm wearing faded blue jeans and a white polo shirt. I can see myself sitting on Elroy Birdall's dock near dusk one evening, the sky a bright, shimmering pink, and I'm finishing up a letter to my parents that tells them what I'm about to do, why I'm doing it, and how sorry I am that I'd never found the courage to talk to them about it. I ask them not to be angry. I try to explain some of my feelings, but there aren't enough words, and so I just say that it's a thing that has to be done. At the end of the letter, I talk about the vacations we used to take up in this north country at a place called Whitefish Lake, and how the scenery here reminds me of those good times. I tell them I'm fine. I tell them I'll write again from Winnipeg or Montreal or wherever I end up.